So I've been thinking about a way to start this for ever, because it also hasn't really been the same thing since I started this project. It's turned into a lot of different things. It started as a documentary that slowly got cut down through realistic things that slowly got built up to other things that I wanted to do that also got cut down by the coronavirus. So what this really is a pitch, a pilot, something that's maybe not the finished product that I envisioned, but it'll do the job, and I think that it's a template for how a potential show could be run, and I think that's what I wanted to do with it. So, onto the prologue. On February 11th, 1970, William Devin Howell is born in Hampton, Virginia, to Melissa and John Howell. He was the youngest of four brothers. His father was 45 and his mother was 40 when they first had Bill. His father, John, was a mechanic that could fix anything. His mother, Melissa, was a lunch lady by day, but worked the grill at Whataburger at night. As a result of this, Bill was lower middle class, but he makes it very clear in his letters to Anne that he was not poor, nor did his family ever physically abuse him. During his childhood, Bill had an alright relationship with his father and was very close with his mother. He learned how to cross-stitch and do ceramics from a very young age. In 1981, when Bill was 11 years old, his mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. Shortly after her diagnosis, she suffered a series of strokes that left her confined to a hospital bed in their living room. In his letters, Bill writes that on multiple occasions, his mother asked him to go get his father's gun and go play in the yard so she could ultimately kill herself. Bill never ended up doing this, but that messes a kid up. A little bit after his mother's diagnosis, when Bill was about 13, he started drinking and dating. He mainly dated a girl named Mandy on and off throughout high school. Mandy and Bill had a complicated relationship. He was always sneaking out to see her, or vice versa. Bill remarks in one of his letters that he doesn't think his mother even met Mandy. There are a lot of stories, but my favorite from the book is one time when Bill tried to hit Mandy's new boyfriend with a tire iron in the parking lot of a 7-Eleven. He ended up missing and accidentally hitting Mandy. Bill also shared 2 children with Mandy over the course of that relationship. However, when Bill and Mandy finally broke up for good, Mandy married another man and took his kids out of state. The last time Bill saw his children, they were 7 and 2 years old. In 1985, when Bill is just 15 years old, Melissa Howell slips into a coma. Bill stayed with his family the first 2 nights his mother was in the hospital, but on the 3rd night he demanded he be able to see his girlfriend, and in his own words, he was getting laid when his mother died. It's interesting to note that Bill apparently bought his first prostitute at the age of 14, at the height of his mother's medical drama. Shortly after her death, Bill started getting into more and more trouble with the law, particularly vandalism and stealing. He also ended up getting charged with 2 DUIs by the time he was 19 years old and got his license taken away from him for 10 years. He never exactly got his license back. Time for the bridge. How did William Devin Howell end up in Connecticut, being a homegrown country boy in Hampton, Virginia? So in the spring of 2000, Bill met a 19-year-old girl named Jessica in an online chat room. Jessica was from Torrington, Connecticut. Keep in mind, at this point, Bill was 30 years old and Jessica was 19. In September, she went down to Virginia to visit Bill, and after a few more visits, decided that she wanted to move down there with him. She slowly began to move her things down to Virginia while fighting in family court in order to take her 2-year-old son out of state. However, in November of 2000, Bill blew a stop sign. And if you were paying attention, Bill never exactly got his license back. So he ended up giving the officer a fake name and social security number, and when the officer turned his back, Bill ran. Bill ran all the way to his friend Harry's house in Windsor, North Carolina. He then told Jessica that she was going to have to take her stuff back from Virginia because he couldn't go back there with another arrest warrant on him. Now, Jessica obviously wasn't very pleased with this, but after a couple of months she cooled down and invited Bill up to Connecticut to celebrate their birthdays in February. At the end of the trip, she asked if Bill would move up to Torrington with her, and in February of 2001, Bill moved to Connecticut. So that's how William Devin Howell ended up in Connecticut. He got a full-time job roofing within a week. He worked a couple of other places, including the Big Y at a deli counter. It was unimportant. He didn't last very long with Jessica and ended up bouncing around with a couple of different relationships before ultimately settling down. However, there was one important girlfriend before this by the name of Amy. Amy and Bill dated for a couple of months, but Amy wasn't really important. Her parents were the ones who were important. Her parents, at the end of their relationship, sold Bill a 1985 Ford Ecoline. And that would eventually become the blue van that Bill kidnapped and murdered 7 women inside of. By August of 2001, Bill was living out of his van full-time. Keep in mind that in his letters, Bill makes it very clear that he didn't consider himself a drifter in the classical sense. Quote, "I didn't live in my van because I had to. I stayed in my van because I chose to. I could have probably gotten my own place, but it didn't make much sense to me. To come up with all the money necessary just to move into a place, and then to buy furniture, and then I've got this great big anchor on me should I ever decide to leave or get laid off." Shortly after starting to live out of his van, Bill met a hairdresser named Dorothy Holcomb at a bar called Illusions in Waterbury. Dory lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in New Britain. Bill and Dory dated all the way up until 2004, however, they never actually lived together. Bill would often spend a few nights at Dory's house during the week, but he would ultimately end up living in his van full-time. On January 25th, 2003, the police were called due to a domestic violence incident at the home of Dorothy Holcomb. At this point, Bill states that her undiagnosed bipolar disorder was getting severely worse, and they were fighting a lot more, and often these fights turned physical. On February 21st, 2003, after leaving a bar called the Cadillac Ranch in Southington, William Devin Howell solicits Melanie Camellini on Grove Street in Waterbury between the hours of 1 and 2 a.m. Bill then drives her to the McDonald's on Thomaston Avenue in Waterbury, where he proceeds to complete the transaction with her. Upon completing the transaction, Bill grabbed her by the throat and duct taped her wrists together as well as her ankles and mouth shut. He then duct taped a plastic bag over her hands so he would be able to hear her trying to get free. He then drove her to the parking lot of the Benco Roofing Company in Torrington, where he raped her until 2 in the afternoon the following day. In the afternoon, Bill drove from the Benco parking lot to Little Woodstock, a section of the state forest in Torrington. After arriving in Little Woodstock, he hit Melanie on the side of the head with a rusty wrench, and then strangled her to death. He intended to bury her there, but it was February, so the ground was too frozen solid in order for Bill to dig. Shortly after, a snowstorm rolled in, and Bill found himself trapped in the middle of the woods. He ended up having to spend the night out there, and had to sleep with the body of Melanie Camellini just to stay warm. Now, mind you, this was Bill's first murder. He was sloppy. He didn't know what he was doing. He was panicked. He actually ended up removing part of Melanie Camellini's jaw, as well as a few of her fingers. This was in a vain attempt in order to conceal her identity. He ended up giving up and disposing of the body parts somewhere in a dumpster in Connecticut. Down below the embankment behind the strip mall, Bill found a barrel and put Melanie's body in there, stacking a couple of pallets on top of it so nobody would find it. On May 17th, 2003, Bill picks up Marilyn Gonzalez at Grove Street around 2 a.m. He then drives her to the same Thomaston Ave McDonald's as he took Melanie Camellini, where they then complete the transaction, and he subsequently kidnaps her and drives her to a parking lot of a Motel 6 in Southington. At around 3 p.m. the following day, he drove her to the McDonald's next to the strip mall in New Britain, where he raped her twice more before strangling her. On June 18, 2003, Bill picks up Janice Roberts in New Britain after leaving the Cadillac Ranch. Now, Janice Roberts is unique. She wasn't like any of the other victims. Janice Roberts was a trans woman whose birth name was Danny Winsat. Bill was not aware of this, but found out mid-transaction when he accidentally pulled her wig off. In a blind rage, Bill punched her in the face a few times before ultimately strangling her. Note, this was the only victim that Bill did not rape. It was also the only victim Bill killed out of anger. All the other prostitutes he killed, it was to conceal the fact that he had raped them. He didn't want a trail left behind. He killed Janice Roberts just out of pure anger. He then subsequently buried her body behind the strip mall. Now, mind you that Bill doesn't exactly remember every single detail about every single one of these crimes. A lot of these were repetitive or places he would drift around to. At some point in mid-2003, Bill picks up Diane Cusack at 2 a.m. behind the 4-star shopping plaza in New Britain. He then drove her down the street to the parking lot behind the Roma Bar on Allen Street, where he raped her throughout the night, sometimes with a shock absorber when he couldn't rape her himself. In the morning, he drove her to the McDonald's parking lot in New Britain, where he raped her until noon, where he strangled her and dumped her behind the strip mall. On July 25, 2003, Bill solicits Nilsa Arizmendi in the parking lot of Stop & Shop in Wethersfield. Now, Nilsa is also unique, not in the sense that anything different happened to her, but Nilsa is the reason why William Devin Howell was caught. Now, Bill had one rule when it came to raping and murdering. Don't kill someone you know. With Nilsa, Bill broke this rule. Bill had met Nilsa and her boyfriend Ace a couple of months prior at a gas station. The three hit it off, and eventually Bill would give them rides in exchange for a couple of dollars. At 2:45, Bill picked her up in the back of the parking lot in Stop & Shop in Wethersfield. However, Nilsa is with her boyfriend Ace at this time. Ace only knows Bill by his middle name, Devin, but sees Nilsa get into the van and never sees her again. Nilsa asked Bill if he could drive her to Hartford in order to get drugs. Bill told her no. Then Nilsa offered to give him a $20 blowjob. This Bill accepted. However, Bill got angry when Nilsa wouldn't finish the job, so he hit her in the side of the head with a rusty wrench and tied her up. He then drove her to the back of an empty business on Farmington Avenue and raped her throughout the night. At dawn, he drove her to the parking lot of Motel 6, where he raped her twice more before strangling her and disposing of her body behind the strip mall in New Britain. On July 30th, 2003, Nilsa's mother, Valeria Arizmendi, reports her missing to the Wethersfield Police Department. And Detective Robert DeRohan is assigned to the case. Initially, Detective DeRohan suspects Ace Sanchez because usually it is the spouse or someone close to the victim. On August 8th, 2003, Ace Sanchez is arrested for possession of narcotics. This is not his first offense. While in jail, Ace tries to tell the authorities of Nilsa's disappearance. However, he kind of gets the runaround, being someone in and out of jail and also a drug addict. However, eventually he writes a letter to the police department in Hartford about the disappearance. Mind you that this letter is lost in the chain of command for a couple of months before Detective DeRohan is made aware of it. On September 14th, 2003, Detective DeRohan is made aware of Ace's letter, and William Devin Howell becomes a suspect in the disappearance of Nilsa Arizmendi. Detective DeRohan also discovers that the van is registered to Bill's girlfriend, Dorothy Holcomb. In late September or early October in 2003, Bill picks up Mary Jane Menard somewhere in Waterbury and drives her to a nearby McDonald's, where she gives him a $30 blowjob. Afterwards, he restrains her and drives her to the parking lot of a Super 8, where he rapes her throughout the night. The next morning, Bill drove to a Motel 6 in Southington, where he raped her throughout the day before ultimately strangling her, then dumping her body in the embankment behind the strip mall. Mind you, this is the second of 3 murders committed in a 1-month span. Make no mistake, Bill was definitely escalating at this point. On October 10th, 2003, Bill picks up Jovelyn Martinez on Hillside Avenue in Hartford. He pretty much went straight to kidnapping with Martinez, and he drove her to the parking lot of a bowling alley along the Berlin Turnpike. He then raped her throughout the night. In the morning, he drove her to a shopping center on New Britain Ave, where he raped her a few more times. Around 4 in the afternoon, he drives her to the McDonald's next to the strip mall, where he rapes her one last time before ultimately strangling her and dumping her body in the embankment. The end of the road. In November of 2003, Detective DeRowan visits Dorothy Holcomb under the guise of investigating lawn care equipment thefts. Bill is inside the house when this happens, and he ends up escaping out the back door, while Dorothy both bides time as well as rebuffs Detective DeRowan. The detective told Dory that the van was a vehicle of interest in some lawn care equipment thefts in the surrounding area. At this point, Ace Sanchez was still the main suspect. Dory was hostile to say the least. She kept grilling the detective about why he was here, and she didn't mention Howell once. She said she drove the van exclusively herself. However, this meeting was important because Detective DeRowan did end up finding the van that Nilsa Arizmendi had disappeared in. November 27, 2003, Bill visits his longtime friend Joseph Ashley Martin in Hampton, Virginia for Thanksgiving. While he's there, Bill asks Martin to help him clean out the van. In a statement later, Martin would say that he helped Bill clear out a weed whacker, a lawnmower, some bags of clothing, and Bill took out the back cushion. Martin also mentions that that there was a foul smell coming from the back of the van, but he didn't take any real note of it because of the overwhelming smell of grass, clippings, and gasoline. According to Martin's affidavit, Bill removed a large stained cushion that lined the bottom bench in the back of his van. The day after Thanksgiving, Bill decided to go visit his friend Harry in Windsor, North Carolina. However, on his way to Harry, around midnight, he ends up getting pulled over for a motor vehicle violation, and he is subsequently arrested, but he posts bond. This traffic stop was very important because of this, Detective DeRowan was able to locate where the van was after it was put into the system when Bill was pulled over. However, Detective DeRowan convinces a judge in North Carolina to arrest Bill on parole charges and have him extradited back to Connecticut. On January 30th, 2004, Bill appears for arraignment in traffic court in North Carolina and is promptly arrested and charged with a parole violation, and is subsequently extradited back to Connecticut by Detective DeRowan. Keep in mind, up until this point, Bill is only a suspect in the disappearance of Nilsa Arizmendi. On April 22, 2004, Bertie County Sheriff's Office seizes the blue van at Harry's home in Windsor, North Carolina. The van is subsequently searched, and they find a bunch of items that are used as evidence later in Bill's trial. These items include, but are not limited to, hair and fibers, blood stains, a rock containing stains and hair fibers, a steak knife, and 2 latent sets of fingerprints. On July 14, 2004, back in New Britain, Ace Sanchez positively IDs William Devin Howell as the last person he saw Nilsa with. On July 22, 2004, Bill is released from prison after serving his sentence for his parole violation. He then begins living with Harry in Windsor, North Carolina. On the same day he was released from prison, the forensic examiner came back with her findings and concluded that the blood inside the back of the van did in fact belong to Nilsa Arizmendi. And in November of 2004, Dorothy Holcomb is called into the station for questioning. This whole investigation culminates around May 13th, 2004. On May 13th, 2004, Bill decides to travel from North Carolina to visit his friend Joseph Ashley Martin. However, Detective Robert DeRowan is also coincidentally going to visit Joseph Ashley Martin on this day. Bill sees DeRowan and his officers approaching the house. He attempts to slip out the back door and runs a few streets over, where he hides in a couple of bushes. However, DeRowan and his officers saw Bill slip out the back door, and they were able to establish a perimeter before Bill got away. Then Detective DeRowan took Joseph Ashley Martin back to the police station, where he questioned him for 6 hours before getting a signed affidavit testifying about Bill and Martin cleaning out the van on Thanksgiving of 2003. On May 17, 2005, Bill is presented in New Britain Superior Court and officially charged with the murder of Nilsa Arizmendi. Bail is set at $2.5 million. On May 28, 2005, Bill first meets Thomas Rodriguez Jr. at Cheshire Correctional Institute. Now, in the book, these two have conflicting statements about their relationship. According to Rodriguez, he simply struck up a conversation with Bill in the rec room, and Bill started talking to him, and they became friends. However, according to Bill, Rodriguez had been following up closely along to the news and recognized Bill as soon as he set foot in the facility, that he was a snake and looking to rat him out from the beginning. But during that first conversation in the rec room, no matter how it happened, Bill did divulge that Detective DeRowan was the one in charge of his case. Rodriguez had worked with Detective DeRowan previously in 2004 when operating as a confidential informant, helping him do some drug busts around the state. In subsequent conversations, Bill divulged more about his case to Rodriguez, including that he was charged with murdering a prostitute. Initially, he claims he had nothing to do with it and that it was probably her pimp, Ace Sanchez, that actually killed her. These series of conversations took place between May 28, 2005 and May 30th, 2005. And in these conversations, Bill tells Rodriguez that there is, yes, they did find blood in the back of his van, and yes, it did belong to Nilsa, but he says that was because her pimp, Ace, had gotten into a fight with her and broke her nose in the back of his van. He also hits home that Ace was a drug addict. The next day, Bill actually flipped his story to say that he was the one who broke Nilsa's nose in the back of his van, but he threw her out of the van right afterwards. Rodriguez also notes that Bill talked a lot about how he wanted Ace to overdose because if Ace had overdosed and died, there wouldn't be much of a trial because there'd be no more witnesses. But Rodriguez wrote all of these notes down and on May 30th contacted Detective DeRowan with the information, and he became a confidential informant in the case against William Devin Howell. On January 24th, 2007, the trial for the murder of Nilsa Arizmendi begins. It isn't a very terribly or interesting trial. There's no shouting or smoking guns. It was a pretty standard trial. Bill was represented by a public defender because he couldn't afford an actual attorney. There were 8 witnesses called to testify over 5 different days, the majority of which were character witnesses and forensic witnesses. Detective DeRowan, the forensic examiner, as well as some of the other arresting officers, made up the majority of the prosecution's witnesses. However, the key witnesses were Ace Sanchez, who saw Nilsa get into William Devin Howell's van, and Joseph Ashley Martin, who helped Bill clean out the van on Thanksgiving of 2003. According to the book, Martin was often a hostile witness and never really answered their questions until they put his signed affidavit in front of him. He was a friend to Bill to the very end. However, before Thomas Rodriguez could take the stand and testify against Bill about what he said in prison, Bill and his lawyer Ken Simon took a recess and negotiated a plea. Bill entered a guilty plea for manslaughter 1 under Connecticut's Alford Doctrine. Now, the Alford Doctrine is kind of interesting. It actually means that Bill and his legal team admitted that they could not win this case and that they were going to lose it, but he does not admit guilt for the actual crime itself. But it does mean the defendant acknowledges that the state has enough evidence to convict. However, at the sentencing hearing, Bill did still insist that he did not kill Nilsa Arizmendi, and he was sentenced to 15 years. Now, mind you, Bill was convicted of manslaughter 1 without a body ever being found. Nobody had found Nilsa Arizmendi or any of the other bodies at this point. It wasn't until August of 2007 where a hunter stumbled across a couple of bones and a skull behind the strip mall in New Britain. Within 2 weeks, 50 different bones of 3 separate women were found. But it took a really long time to actually identify these remains. There was Jane Doe number 1, Jane Doe number 2, and Jane Doe number 3. In December 2010, Jane Doe number 2 was identified as 48-year-old Diane Cusack. In May of 2013, Jovelyn Martinez was identified as Jane Doe number 1. Jane Doe number 3 took the longest to identify because the only thing that were found at the time were the right femur and tibia. On September 26, 2014, 11 years after her disappearance, Mary Jane Menard was identified as Jane Doe number 3. In April of 2015, the remains of 4 more victims are unearthed by a cadaver-sniffing dog on loan from the FBI. Those 4 bodies include Nilce Arizmendi, Marilyn Gonzalez, Melanie Camellini, and Janice Roberts. All of their bodies were identified within a few months. 3 months later, in July of 2015, Anne K. Howard, the author of the book, first contacts William Devin Howell. Shortly after they first contact, William Devin Howell is charged with the remaining 6 murders. On September 8, 2015, with overwhelming evidence against him, William Devin Howell pleads guilty for the remaining 6 murders. He's given 6 consecutive life sentences or 360 years in federal prison. He currently resides in Cheshire Correctional Institution.